Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Calvary Conversations. I'm your host for this episode, Joshua Paxton, Director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement here at Calvary University. And with me today is Dr. Mark Hedinger, Executive Director of CultureBound, Adjunct Professor at Western Seminary in Portland, and he has also served, how long were you? Well, you still serve as a missionary with CrossWorld, which CrossWorld is one of our synergy partners here at Calvary. He has been married to his wife, Karen, for how long now, Mark?
Oh, goodness, you're going to get me in trouble. I'm supposed to know these things right off the top of my head. Karen, how long have we been married?
Oh, and she's there.
Almost 38 years.
Almost 38 years.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Oh, they have 4 children and 11 grandchildren. And he is, and I found it, he is the co-author with Dr. Enoch Wan of Relational Missionary Training. You can see how much I have poured over this particular book. But our topic for today is how churches, local churches, can be intentional in reaching the nations right next door. So Kansas City alone, Mark is in Portland, which is probably even a greater number than we have here in Kansas City. But in Kansas City, there's 63 plus ethnic groups that are part of, that's only the ones who are part of the Ethnic Enrichment Commission. We know that, just immigration is not something that's going away, it's only going to increase. And so, Mark, do you actually have off the top of your head any statistics on how many different ethnic groups are in Portland?
I don't. No, it would be interesting to know. We've got some anecdotal ideas, but I don't have numbers.
Okay, so I was just curious. Yeah. So, we want to start. You are the executive director of CultureBound, and so let's start with what is CultureBound and what do you do?
Yeah, thank you. CultureBound is an organization that we actually date back into the mid-1960s, but our focus, our goal is to equip organizations, people, individuals to be more effective at ministry in a different culture and with a second language, in an unfamiliar language. So we don't teach language per se, we don't teach specific cultures per se, we teach people how to go about learning those things. So we work with mission organizations, we work with churches, we work with schools, we work with a variety of different kinds of organizations that have to work across cultures. And in the past, those organizations almost always were sending an expat to live overseas.
Yes.
So that's where we started off. But then we realized, well, that same skill set is really necessary for example, a local church that wants to reach into a community that's shifting and changing around them, and there's a much higher number of immigrants in that community. Well, how do you reach them? Well, it's not the same thing as reaching your American neighbors was 30 years ago. So we found that the same tool set actually can be very helpful for that local church kind of context.
Yes, absolutely. And even then, I don't want anybody who's listening to this to necessarily check out because they're like, hey, well, I'm not involved in cross-cultural ministry, but a lot of the tools, a lot of the skills that are involved in cross-cultural ministry are equally applicable to, people who aren't necessarily of a different culture, but they don't share our worldview. They don't have a Christian worldview.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So bridging that gap into a different worldview that's different, moving from a point of view that says the Bible is true and that there is that there is a God, and moving that into a more secular context where people either reject that outright or just say it's irrelevant. The other place where our training has been effective and really helpful is crossing generations. And so,
yes.
Myself as mid 60s, young 60s, working with lots of people around us in their mid 20s. The experiences, the things that shaped me are very different than the things that shaped my colleagues and my neighbors and my the 20 somethings around me. And so learning how to bridge that gap has turned into, interestingly enough, has turned into kind of part of our work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As I work on my dissertation, I'm doing a lot of research on Generation Z, and as a Gen Xer, member of the forgotten generation, nobody really talks about us that much. But a lot of differences there in technology, familiarity with technology, and growing up with it, and how that has affected their development and everything. And we all know it remains to be seen what post-COVID generation will do. So how has your experience placed you in a unique situation for helping local churches reach peoples of other ethnicities right next door?
What we've discovered, and this is just kind of putting words on something that we've understood for a long time, but we're now able to say it a lot more clearly, is that nobody can actually teach you another culture. You'll want to find that book that's going to say, this is everything you need to know about your Mexican neighbors. My wife and I and our 4 kids lived in Mexico for 12 years. And we were in one part of the country. And when we would talk to people from another part of the country, it was a completely different set of realities. So, simple point, there's no simple video series or book that's going to say, here's everything you need to know to be able to reach into this people group. And we sort of wish that it was so, but it's not. That's just not reality. What is reality is nobody can teach you, but you can learn.
Yes.
It is really possible to be a self-directed learner at going into a new culture and saying, okay, I can frame my own questions, and I can find my own answers, and I can learn how to adjust, and I can actually learn how to have a fruitful interaction with this other group of people whose experiences and background and worldview is very different than mine, and I can learn how to do that. So we teach people the attitudes and the skills that are going to help them to be self-directed at learning a new culture and a new language.
So as I listen to that, I'm reminded of conversations that I frequently have with students as an intercultural studies professor, and the student would like me to give them, okay, well, here's the 10 things that if you just do this in this particular culture, you'll be okay. But it doesn't exist. It takes work, and it takes effort to dig in there and build relationships and really learn from people. So so if a local church has a vision, let's maybe talk to some of the pastors or church leaders who might be watching us today. If a local church has a vision for reaching other ethnic groups around them, what should they know? Where do they begin? Just let's say, I'm a pastor and I got this people group who's living next door, and I really want to reach out to them with the gospel. Where do I start?
Yeah, I would start, part of the place that we come from is the idea that there really truly are relationships, and human relationships in a certain sense kind of trump everything else about intercultural work. If you can start to develop those human relationships, that's going to give you an avenue for learning. It's going to give you an avenue for sharing, for teaching. It's going to help every single way. It's going to give you that emotional and that motivational perspective to be able to move into those other conversations too. So the first place to start, we would say, is a relationship with the Lord, and say, Lord, are you leading us into this people group? Because sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he says, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the othermost parts of the world. That's still part of our Bible. That's still true. But it may be that he's got somebody else working in that particular ethnic group or that particular cultural group that's close to you. So Absolutely. You say, okay, Lord, our calling isn't to that. Maybe do we have a calling? Do you want to direct us somewhere else? So we would really strongly say, start by saying, Lord, would you direct us? But then as he starts directing you, that first step is really to just start with a humble spirit, an attitude of a learner, saying, how do I get involved? Try going into their marketplace. Try walking through the neighborhood where a number of those people live. But do it not saying I've got the answers and I want to come in here and teach these people. Do it saying, no, I have to start by learning from these people. What are their values? What are they looking for in life? Because the Bible probably will bridge that gap somehow. Maybe with a corrective, almost always a little bit of a corrective and a little bit of an encouragement. But so that's where you start. You start by that humble approach of saying, I need to learn these people before I can start to minister to and with them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sparked something in my head. It's not on my list of things to talk about necessarily, but how important is it? You mentioned taking the posture of a learner, and so how important is it that in taking that posture of a learner, we also reflect upon how the Bible interacts with our own culture, and sometimes we can place our culture on top of biblical things, and then that can affect how we interact with people of other cultures.
Oh, that is so true. Yeah, amazing book, the Bible, amazing conversation or communication from God to us, and allows us to see ourselves in a whole lot more reality than we do when we're just comparing ourselves with ourselves. And so when we start comparing ourselves with God's word, we realize, like Isaiah, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips. And there's not a people group on the planet that can say, well, we've got this all nailed. We don't. We are also in need of continuing to grow in the grace and the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. That 2 Peter passage is just forever ringing in my ears. It's a continual growth on this side of eternity. And I can hardly wait sometimes to find out. So, and what happens on the other side of eternity? How do those people to people relationships? What are those going to look like when we no longer are, bogged down with our own presuppositions and sinful natures? So, yeah, it's a matter that to learn somebody else's culture, one of the key ingredients is to know ourselves well and to know what are the assumptions that we make about life, what are the assumptions that we make about what's important, and how to value things. We were working with a family just not very long ago that's on their way into a part of the world where normal dinner time in the evening is about 10 o'clock at night, and normal bedtime's 1 a.m, and people have a long period where they just enjoy socializing in the late, what we would consider to be kind of late night. And they're saying, wow, this is going to be
falling asleep at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. No, man, I'm at 10 o'clock. I'm done. I'm out of here. And so they're saying, so how's that going to work? And I said, well, you're going to have to make some adjustments. The countryside around you is not. They're not going to adjust to you. So if you want to be invited to people's homes, if you want to be a part of their social life, you have to adjust. And that's part of what goes into intercultural work anywhere, is there's a two-way adjusting that happens. But if you're finding yourself in a neighborhood where something like that is normal, then you have to adjust to it and kind of get into sync, get into that same rhythm of life to a certain degree, so that you can build the bridges.
Yes. Yeah, I recall being in Italy. So basically all of the businesses shut down between like 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So, and then they would open at 4 o'clock and be open until like 8, 9 o'clock at night. And so you had to know, I'm not going to be able to do something between those hours. I've either got to get it done sooner or I'm going to have to wait. Yeah.
And then you enter into that and you say, wow, everybody else is taking a nap right now, or whatever the normal activity is. And how about if I join and do that same thing? And that way I'm on the same, like I said, I think syncing is a really good word sometimes. How can I sync up with their patterns so that I'm better equipped to be able to build those bridges of understanding between myself and my neighbors.
Yeah. And so, I mean, put that in the context of, someone coming to the United States. If that's their pattern, that could still be their pattern, even though they're here. And you have to recognize that, so when it's appropriate to go out and try and build relationships and find people, and when you're not going to find anybody because they're all at home, taking their nap, taking their siesta or whatever.
Yeah. And by the way, we teach this on both sides. I'm not saying that it's always got to be, one group that makes the adjustments.
Oh, sure.
This is something that, in a best case scenario, everybody's saying, oh, okay, I've got a certain set of patterns of my life, and the people around me have different patterns. I would like to build a bridge there somehow or another. I have to adjust. They have to adjust. And so sometimes I think it's really a good thing to call on the immigrant populations and say, you're now living in a different context, and you'd really do well to try to enter into those patterns. Younger families that have kids in school, they're going to do that pretty naturally. They pretty much have to fall into those patterns. But sometimes that can be an important conversation too. It's not just a one-way street. It's one of the reasons I use the picture of a bridge a lot. Bridges, usually have two-way traffic on them, and I think that's a good metaphor.
Yeah. Except for the ones in the country where I was raised, where you had to stop and then one person, and then the other person could sell. But, even there, all right, there's got to be some unspoken agreement that, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to let you go. And then after you go, because otherwise, well, it's just not pretty. So
my parts of the Midwest growing up, when that would happen, the rule was, if you're bigger, you keep going. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, pretty much. So, all right. So, well, I'll just go ahead and ask this one. Maybe we already touched on it a little bit, but so what are some practical steps that the pastor and his church can begin taking, even today? Let's say somebody's listening to this, they're struck with, hey, I want to get out there and do something. What are some practical steps they can start taking?
Good. We recommend, we actually at our organization, that we'd invite people to get in touch with us and give us a phone call or an email or whatever. We would love to converse more. But we work on some tool sets. One is a means of being able to more carefully observe what's going on around you. We all get into our patterns of life, and we think that we see what's happening, but the fact is that we only think we see what's going on around us because we're so familiar with it. But if we can slow that down and start saying, oh, wow, now I'm paying attention to the clock, and I see that at this certain time things happen, at this time they don't. So finding a way to be very deliberate about that kind of objective measuring. What colors are important? What are the foods that people like? How do people correct one another? What are the conversations? Who talks to whom? How do people touch one another? Just what are those? And so we talk about 12 languages of culture, and using those as a tool to be able to more objectively actually see what's going on. That's a good first step. Another really powerful tool that we work with a lot is what we call the culture tree. And it's just seeing how everything actually connects. If people have a certain set of behaviors or act a certain way on Monday morning, it's not just a random coincidence. There's probably some values and some experiences and some invisible culture that's behind that. And we really don't, our interest really isn't in changing behaviors. As Christ followers, we're always pointing back to the heart, aren't we? And so the culture tree, we use the picture, the analogy of the roots of a tree instead of that biblical picture of the heart. Well, the Bible actually uses trees and roots as well in some other places. Yes. But go to that invisible world. Start to understand what's motivating people and what are the relationships that are key to them. And you'll start to see, how does the organizational pattern work, and how do people decide who's going to get invited to a party, and why is it that this group, everybody who's involved in this business are all related to each other? And you'll start to see the why behind all of that. And that's another really important practical step of understanding how to work well within a culture. So
Yes.
objectively seeing the patterns and then being able to put those patterns together into a meaningful kind of a diagram, a map, if you will, of how the culture works. Those are two very real possibilities and things that we help people to be able to start to map out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is very good. Yeah, I think it's Hesselgrave, David Hesselgrave, and some others who also use the illustration of an onion.
Mm-hmm.
Culture is like an ogre. Ogres are like onions, and so, but you have to peel back the layers to
Yeah.
get to what is that root value or belief that is resulting in this particular behavior,
Mm-hmm.
because all too often, either because we don't understand this or simply say this, maybe we're a little bit too lazy. We focus on the outside behavior, but no amount of behavioral change will ever really result in anything that lasts a long time.
That's right. We'll change patterns for a short period of time, but once the authority is gone, once that person leaves, everything kind of returns back to its normal, its status quo. And yeah, we used the onion for years and years, and it's a good model. It's a good picture too. I actually like trees better because trees are living and they grow and
Sure.
develop over years, and that's what
Sure.
happens with the culture.
Yep.
They're living things that are not static. They shift and change. Everything's connected, but it's still always kind of in a dynamic rhythm.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So how about the pastor who is, or the church, don't want to just pick on the pastors, but the church that's looking to start a multicultural church? What advice would you have for them in how they might go about making those connections, helping their congregation deal with the ambiguity maybe of a multicultural church?
The fun thing about multicultural church, as opposed to what we've been talking about up till now, is reaching into one other cultural group. So, for instance, the church that I'm involved with, we have a broadly Hispanic, Latino part of our church, and then a broadly Anglo part of our church, and they interact well. Similar kinds of cultural backgrounds, not exactly the same, but pretty similar. If we really said we wanted to be a multicultural church and include, the Korean and Vietnamese and Kenyan folks that live in our neighborhoods, it really becomes a different matter, because now instead of going out and wanting to learn everybody's culture, now we've got to turn it inside a little bit and say, what's the culture we want to develop within our church? Now,
Mm,
any church
okay.
has to do that, but once again, the culture tree can be a really helpful tool to do that. So a multicultural church is not going to be just Vietnamese and North American. It's going to have to include those two. It's going to have to be a welcoming place and a place of growth and a place of strength for those two, as well as the Kenyan and the Mexican and the others. How do you do that? Well, you start by saying, let's be deliberate about creating the kind of culture environment within our church that shows the kind of worship towards God and the kind of love and care towards one another in ways that multiple different ethnic and cultural groups are going to recognize and feel. So
That's
multicultural
great.
kind of enters into a whole different realm. To me, it's really interesting how that multicultural is different than just bicultural. Working with two, you need to understand pretty deeply both of them. Multicultural, you have to put your focus on creating that environment, that internal environment is going to be welcoming to a lot of different points of view.
That's great. So, what do we maybe emphasizing more what are the things that we have in common as we're all trying to approach a biblical worldview together.
That's well said. Yeah, well said. So, maybe just a simple illustration. What time do church meetings take place? Worship times. I don't know that this is true. Maybe this is something that every church has to figure out on its own. But the story I've heard is that in the U.S. we began meeting Sunday mornings at fairly early, mid morning-ish kind of time, largely out of an agricultural need to take care of things on the farm. And then, it turns out that was not of all of interest to the Hispanic group that we're working with now, that said, we're not on the farm anymore. We actually could meet, and for us, our families, early afternoon is the perfect time. And we all looked at each other and said, well, why not? So it was a matter of dialogue and discussion and finding the best place to exhibit those patterns that we know God is wanting us to develop. Don't neglect the meeting, the joining together of yourselves. Don't neglect those meetings. But when, where,
but that
how?
Doesn't have to mean Sunday at like 10 o'clock. Yeah,
that's it. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a simple, almost too simple of an illustration, but that happens by dialogue. That happens by saying, how do we not assume that what we've always done is what we ought to do in this multicultural environment?
Absolutely. So, Mark, the time has gone way too fast. And so that is really all we have time for today. I've got to bring us to a close, but maybe we can circle back around sometime and continue this conversation for some of our listeners here. So, if one last thing, if somebody's listening today and they would like to get in touch with you for some of the training that you all do, what would be a good way for them to do that?
The easiest is just find us on the internet, culturebound.org. We are just those two words, culture and bound, run them together and put an ORG at the end, and you'll find us. And we would love to talk to you. And Josh, this has been a pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. It's great having you. So, well, thank you. And thank everyone who listened today. God bless everybody. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.